You're listening to Stories from the Presbyterian Pew. This podcast is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating lay people in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, about PCA church government and process. On our website, we offer free, self-paced courses to help you understand the Book of Church Order, the BCO. These courses cover how the BCO works in theory, but what does it actually look like in practice? Stories from the Presbyterian Pew gives you an opportunity to hear directly from those who have walked through or observed what happens when the wheels of church process are set in motion. The stories we share are all true and all happened in PCA churches. All names and place names have been changed to protect the identities of the storytellers and others who play a role in their stories. Our goal is to facilitate understanding and awareness. Think of these stories as case studies, embodied and brought alive by the voices of our storytellers. Hello again. We are back for another episode about overtures that have been sent to the 2025 PCA General Assembly. In the first episode in this series, we talked about business from last year that is carried over to this year. And one of those items were reports from Mission to the World and Committee on Discipleship Ministries about the book Jesus Calling. When I recorded that episode, I said that I hadn't seen the reports, and then they were published the next day. So I'll link to that article in the show notes of this episode in case anyone is interested. Those reports will still need to be voted on during General Assembly. In the last episode, we also talked about overtures that change presbytery boundaries, overtures related to studies and study committees, overtures related to the directory of worship. So if you're interested in any of those kinds of overtures, hop back and catch up on the 2025 General Assembly Overtures Part 1. I had originally planned for this to be a 2-part special series, but there are so many overtures to cover this year that we're actually looking at a 4-part series instead. So today's episode is part 2. I hope to be able to release part 3 on Friday. Normally, our Stories from the Presbyterian Pew episodes only come out on Tuesdays, but we're up against General Assembly and we're up against the amount of talking that I can do in one episode about all of these overtures. So again, part 2 today, hopefully part 3 Friday, and then part 4 next Tuesday. Today, we are going to look at overtures that are related to officers and ordination. Then we'll get into overtures related to vows of church membership and specifically the membership of children or young people in the church. In the third episode, hopefully Friday, we'll talk about a whole bundle of overtures that are related to various committees and agencies of the PCA. And then the last category, next Tuesday, in the 4th part, we'll talk about overtures that are related to the rules of discipline. So just as a reminder, we've got 2 helpful resources if you're following along and you want to be keeping up with all of these numbers and what they apply to. There is a massive article summarizing all of the overtures, and we also have a Facebook group for discussion and questions. Both are linked in the show notes. Now let's dive into a few overtures about officers and ordination. Overture 6 seeks to adjust the requirement that applicants who wish to come under care of a presbytery must submit that application at least a month in advance of the presbytery meeting by allowing presbyteries to set their own deadlines. To explain a little bit about what that means, when a man enters seminary or he begins on a course of training towards ordination, he may come under care in a PCA presbytery. So the best case scenario would be that he's recommended by his home church, and someone from his home church, maybe his pastor, acts as a sponsor or a mentor for him during the seminary years and the ordination process. Coming under care of presbytery is a fairly simple process compared to other things like applying for licensure to preach or applying for ordination. In our presbytery, the candidate just shares briefly about his Christian testimony and his sense of call to the ministry. Coming under care doesn't involve any written or oral examinations. The 1-month requirement that something need to be submitted a month in advance in order for someone to ask to come under care of the presbytery is probably a holdover from the time when applications would need to be sent by mail And then the docket would need to be crafted and mailed out to all the people in advance of a presbytery meeting. It just makes sense to leave it to each presbytery as to how much advance notice they need to make sure that they can include a candidate to come under care on the docket for their presbytery meeting. Overture 8 suggests that just as teaching elders must state and then the presbytery must report those stated differences with the Westminster Confession of Faith before ordination, ruling elders and deacons must do the same, and then their exceptions have to be recorded in the minutes of the session. The PCA is officially a two-office denomination. Our Book of Church Orders says that the only two offices are elder and deacon, and then the office of elder is divided into two classes: ruling elder, which we usually just refer to as elder, and teaching elder, which we commonly call pastor. By the nature of our system of government, there are already quite a number of distinctions between our two classes of elders. I'm sure you can think of some just off the top of your head. And I think if we're going to be a two-office denomination, those distinctions ought to be as few as possible. So for that reason, I'm in favor of at least ruling elders being required to state their differences with the Westminster Confession and the catechisms in the process of their ordination. Now, this practice is likely already happening in many churches, but there is currently no mechanism for reporting that or for those exceptions to be reviewed by presbyteries or the General Assembly. So I imagine debate on this overture will really center around the wording of this, the mechanics of how it would all work, although I do see some arguments about why it may not be necessary to require ruling elders and deacons to do this at all. Overture 10 deals with the office of the assistant pastor, and this office is a bit of an anomaly in the PCA. In the introduction to the Book of Church Order, there are 8 preliminary principles which provide a foundational concept for our system of church government. Preliminary Principle 6 says, though the character, qualifications, and authority of church officers are laid down in the Holy Scriptures, as well as the proper method of officer investiture, the power to elect persons to the exercise of authority in any particular society resides in that society. And when this is discussed in general terms in PCA circles, what we generally talk about is that PCA church members have a right to vote on and elect the people who will exercise authority over them. So when a church elects a solo or senior pastor or an associate pastor, the congregation votes on that person's call to serve in that church. And then that solo, senior, or associate pastor would have a vote on the session. So they would be governing, having authority over that church by the vote of the congregation. However, assistant pastors are not chosen by the congregation. They're chosen by the session. For that reason, assistant pastors don't have a vote on the session. However, because they are teaching elders and because they are ordained by the presbytery and they're members of the presbytery, they actually do have a vote at presbytery and at General Assembly. So legitimate concerns have been raised about someone who hasn't been elected by a congregation still having governing authority over that congregation, at least at the presbytery and General Assembly level. However, people have also pointed out that besides assistant pastors, there are other men who are members of presbytery who haven't been elected by a local church, such as a hospital chaplain or a seminary professor. Those are teaching elders ordained in the presbytery, members of the presbytery. They have voting rights in the presbytery and at General Assembly, even though no local church has elected them to a position of authority. Historically, the office of assistant pastor really was designed for giving a newer ordinand an opportunity for practice in church work, even though he might not have the experience to be elected as a senior pastor or an associate pastor at another church. And it was intended to be a short-term position. So some have argued that the role of assistant pastor is no longer needed and that this level of career development would be available during an internship. In the past, there's been discussion about eliminating the role of assistant pastor altogether. That isn't the goal of this particular overture. The recommendation in this overture is to limit the term of an assistant pastor to only 5 years, and then it could be extended by a vote of 3/4 of the congregation towards the end of that 5-year period. Some people have noted that, hey, if there's a congregation that's willing to vote on a pastor and would even approve him at a rate of a 3/4 majority, perhaps he should be elected to be an associate pastor and have a vote on the session rather than extending his tenure as an assistant pastor. The overture also raises questions about For example, what would become of men who are already serving as assistant pastors who weren't hired with any of these limitations in place? Overture 24 deals with a portion of the Book of Church Order, chapter 24, paragraph 1, that was just added within the last couple of years. Although it doesn't explicitly say so in the language, it was adopted in response to concerns about how a candidate for office describes his struggle with same-sex attraction. So the original amendment, the text as it currently stands right now in today's BCO, includes this sentence: "The session may render a decision on Christian experience at any point in the process, and based on that decision, may judge him ineligible for that election." This amendment would change that sentence to allow for this judgment of ineligibility to apply not only to the candidate standing for election for the first time, but also to a candidate who has previously been elected to office. For example, in some churches, elders serve on a kind of a rotating basis, or they serve a certain number of years of a term, like a 4-year term, at which time they maybe take a year off as a sabbatical and then could stand for election again. So this would also apply to anyone who had previously served as an officer and is now coming back to serve another term. So the new statement would read, "The session may render a decision on Christian experience at any point in the process, and based on that decision may judge the nominee, whether previously ordained or not, ineligible for that election." The purpose of this amendment is to make it clear that this character evaluation may be applied not only to new candidates for office, but also returning candidates. However, some have raised concerns that this new wording would mean that a man who was formerly ordained to office could be deemed unfit for that office without the normal process of either a judicial proceeding, like a trial, or a vote of the congregation. There actually is a procedure in the Book of Church Order for a congregation to vote that they believe a man is no longer qualified to be an officer in that church. And it doesn't have to relate to any particular charge or any particular sin. They could just say, after reflecting on his work here, we think perhaps he's not called to this office. We no longer believe that he exhibits the gifts and the strengths that would make him a good fit for an officer of this congregation. So apart from any judicial proceeding or this type of vote by the congregation, should a session really just determine this person shouldn't be an officer in the church when they actually have already served in that capacity previously? Overture 25 seeks to add a class of associate membership for honorably retired teaching elders. So teaching elders are members of presbyteries and not members of local churches. Normally, if a teaching elder moves to work in another presbytery, his membership would be transferred to a new presbytery after the new presbytery has approved his call and the sending presbytery has approved his release. However, an honorably retired teaching elder wouldn't ordinarily be taking a call, and therefore he wouldn't have a mechanism to transfer presbyteries even if he moved to a different location. So you could imagine a man honorably retires as a teaching elder in one area, and then perhaps he moves to another area for his retirement, maybe to be closer to family, maybe to move further south. So the associate membership proposed in this overture would enable him to maintain membership in the presbytery in which he was honorably retired, which he may no longer be geographically close to, while being assigned to the care of a local church for shepherding. It seems to me that there's wide-ranging consensus that this overture is not needed, as most presbyteries already keep in touch with honorably retired teaching elders to make sure they are connected to a local church. And there's also some concern that the requirements of this overture may prove to be cumbersome and create unintended consequences. Overture 30 relates to the call of a teaching elder who is serving out of bounds in a, quote, needful work. So the Book of Church Order provides pretty clear guidelines about the role that a local church and a presbytery play when a local church seeks to call a man as their pastor, or when the man or the congregation wishes to dissolve that call. That's all clearly outlined, how that's all supposed to work and how the presbytery and the local church interact and what their roles are. However, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are other types of ordained teaching elders in presbyteries who are serving in capacities besides just pastor of a local PCA church. So there's been some confusion or concern about how these relationships work. For example, if a man is ordained to serve as a campus pastor for Reformed University Fellowship, does the presbytery need to approve his ordination and his call before he begins that work, like he would if he was being ordained as a pastor of a local church, or if Reformed University Fellowship wishes to terminate his employment, what role does the presbytery play in that action? Another snag is that some of the vows that are included in the Book of Church Order for teaching elders to take when they are ordained don't actually apply to someone who's taking a role in something other than serving in a local church. So this overture proposes to amend actually 5 different places in the Book of Church Order. I won't get into all of them. You can look it up online and read the overture if you want to, but making amendments in a number of different places to account for the distinctions and the unique features of ordaining a teaching elder to a needful work as opposed to your typical pastor of a local church. It seems like this overture, or at least maybe some amended version of it, would be helpful to iron out these situations that aren't clearly addressed in the Book of Church Order, and there seems to be broad support for some type of thing like this to be developed and adopted. Overture 34 requests the General Assembly to require each presbytery directory to include a listing of the ordained ruling elders and deacons from each church, as well as who performs the functions of a diaconate if there are no ordained deacons. So a little bit of background. Last year, the General Assembly made final approval of an amendment specifying that the titles of pastor, elder, and deacon can only be used for qualified men who are ordained to those offices. So I believe this overture is stemming from some who are concerned that churches may refer to unordained women by the title of deacon, or churches may choose to not ordain any deacons at all in an attempt to abide by the Book of Church Order without creating distinctions between men and women who are serving in the same capacity but are called something else, like a care team or a mercy ministry team. So this overture seeks to gather data about the ordained officers. One potential problem with this overture is that it seeks to gather this information by making a change in the rules of assembly operation, which is the portion of the Book of Church Order that governs the General Assembly. It's not a document that governs presbyteries or sessions, at least directly. Chapter 16 of the Rules of Assembly Operation, the portion that's being considered for amendment in this overture, actually covers the review of presbytery records, which is a committee that does exactly what it sounds like it does. It reviews the records of each presbytery. Section 4 of this chapter covers the records which each presbytery must submit annually, and one piece of those records is called the Directory of Presbytery. So this is what the Rules of Assembly Operation 16-4 says about this directory. A current directory of presbytery including 1, a list of all teaching elders with their addresses and their status, and of all churches and missions with the address of the church and the name and address of the clerk of session. 2, a listing of all officers and committee members of the regular committees of presbytery. And 3, a list identifying all candidates under care, interns, and licentiates of the presbytery with their addresses and their statuses. So if you think about those different categories that are being required to be included in a directory of presbytery, you've got teaching elders, which are members of presbytery. So that makes sense that they would be included in a directory of presbytery. Churches belong to presbyteries, and so they and their clerks are listed for purposes of contact. Officers and committee members who are serving on committees of presbyteries are clearly serving presbytery roles. And then also candidates who are under care, which we talked about a moment ago, interns, licentiates, that just means people who are licensed to preach. Those are all under the jurisdiction of presbytery. So again, it makes sense that all of those would be listed in a directory of presbytery. Ruling elders and deacons, however, are not under the jurisdiction of a presbytery simply by virtue of holding those offices. It's the local session who ordains ruling elders and deacons and maintains a list of those ordained officers in the local church. So is this something that presbyteries ought to be required to report on each year? Do the names of local church officers belong in a document called the Directory of Presbytery? And finally, is the section of the Rules of Assembly Operation on the review of presbytery records the proper place to legislate about officers of local churches? So next, let's take a look at some overtures that have to do with church membership, vows, and specifically the membership of children. Overture 19 proposes to amend the vows of church membership as outlined in BCO 57.5 by slightly changing the wording of the current second and fifth vows and then adding a new first vow, bumping all the others up by one, which would create a total of 6 membership vows. So the new first vow would read, "Do you agree that you are made in the image of God, designed by God to glorify him and enjoy him forever?" The current first vow reads, "Do you acknowledge yourself to be sinners in the sight of God, justly deserving his displeasure, and without hope save his sovereign mercy?" If this overture passed, this would become the new second vow, and it would be slightly amended to read, "Do you acknowledge yourselves to be both beloved and sinners in the sight of God, justly deserving his displeasure, and without hope save his sovereign mercy?" And finally, the language of the current fifth vow, which would be the sixth vow, would be changed from promising to study the purity and peace of the church to promising to promote the purity and peace of the church. An update primarily just to avoid confusion for the sake of modern readers and listeners. So 2 of the reasons given for this overture are that our current 5 membership vows mention nothing of the love of God for sinners, and our current 5 membership vows give no indication of what human beings are saved unto, just what they are saved from. And personally, I am deeply sympathetic to this overture because I've definitely observed the destructive impact of churches or church leaders who begin their understanding of biblical anthropology with the fall and man's sinfulness instead of with the creation of man in the image of God and very good. I personally would love to see this added to what members profess to believe when they join the church. However, concerns have been raised about the impact of changing membership vows when plenty of people have already joined but used different membership vows. And apparently, historically, it seems unlikely that the General Assembly is going to change the vows of church membership. Recently, discussion has arisen about admitting young, even very young, children to full communicant membership and the Lord's Supper, and whether these young members are fully capable of voting for church officers. So there are 2 potential extremes in this conversation, and I'm going to kind of list the hyperbolically exaggerated extremes just to paint a picture. These aren't necessarily cases that I know of or anything that I've personally witnessed, but just for the sake of discussion, the first extreme are churches that lean towards an almost paedo-communion practice. Now, paedo-communion is the belief that children of believers are not only members of the covenant, but are also full communing members of the church by virtue of their baptism. While this is contrary to our Constitution and PCA churches are not allowed to teach or practice this view at all, there are churches that allow very young children to be admitted to the Lord's Supper. In an extreme case, imagine, for example, a 3-year-old voting on elder candidates. In a large family with an authoritative father, you could imagine one man essentially controlling a large number of votes. And in a small church, that could make a significant impact. The other extreme would be churches that don't allow children to become communicant members until much later. So let's say a church says, we're not even going to consider a child for communicant membership in the church until they're 16 or 18. And then what you'd have is children who are believers and could articulate their faith, but are not able to come to the Lord's table and to receive that means of grace in the worship service. So some overtures have been proposed to try and address or balance these concerns. Overture 13 seeks to reconcile 2 portions of the Book of Church Order to make the wording more uniform between these 2 sections. In chapter 24, which talks about the election of officers, BCO 24:3 says, "All communing members in good and regular standing, but no others, are entitled to vote in the election of church officers." And then in the very next chapter, which is about congregational meetings, BCO 25:1 says, "The congregation shall consist of all the communing members of a particular church, and they only are entitled to vote." So this overture essentially proposes to amend the second sentence, BCO 25:1, to say, "The congregation consists of all communing members of a particular church, and only members in good and regular standing are entitled to vote." So essentially inserting that language about good and regular standing into this parallel phrasing. This overture doesn't give much in the way of the reasoning behind it, other than pointing out that these 2 sections are currently different. But apparently the language about regular members may be relevant to conversations about setting a voting age, and as you'll see, that's going to come up in the next overture that we talk about. So Overture 22 seeks to allow congregations to set a minimum age for voting in officer elections by adding a sentence to BCO 25.1. This overture includes a 19-page rationale, so I am not even going to attempt to do justice to that. If you'd like to look up Overture 22 and read the rationale, I would invite you to do so. But essentially, BCO 25.1 would have an additional sentence that would read, a congregation may establish a rule setting a minimum voting age, in parentheses, regular standing, but it must be adopted by a 2/3 majority at a congregational meeting that is called with at least 30 days' notice. It's important to note that this overture does not, in and of itself, set any minimum voting age, nor does it even require congregations to have a minimum voting age, but it merely creates a possibility that a congregation could establish such a voting age. However, a major concern raised about this overture is that it essentially creates a third class of membership. So we already have non-communicant members, children of believers who've been baptized but not made a profession of faith, and then full communicant members. So this overture would allow churches to essentially create a third category, members who are fully communicant in the sense that they could take the Lord's Supper, but they're not allowed to vote in congregational meetings. And I think it's also really important that we consider what we communicate. If we suggest that someone could have the mental and spiritual maturity to examine their hearts and to partake of the Lord's Supper, and yet not the mental and spiritual maturity to vote on officers of the church. Overture 33 proposes to add clarification about the process of admitting a young person to church membership by including this sentence in BCO 57.2, a paragraph that speaks about examining young people for membership in the church. The new sentence would read, the examination shall include an evaluation of the young person's credible profession of faith, the young person's understanding of the meaning of the Lord's Supper, and the young person's understanding of the questions in BCO 57-5, which are those membership questions that we just talked about a minute ago. In my opinion, this is a better solution than creating the option of a voting age, but I also think it's worth asking whether this change would really solve any problems. So church sessions are already likely asking these very kinds of questions when they examine children for membership, and it's unclear that adding this level of specificity would actually eliminate the present difficulty. It's already a decision that involves a good deal of wisdom and discretion when a session is examining a child. It's not something that can be determined with quantitative measures. So I'm not sure that adding more checkboxes would really take away the difficulty that churches and sessions may already be wrestling with. That's all we have for this episode. But as I said, I hope to be back on Friday when we will be discussing all kinds of overtures that have to do with various permanent committees and agencies of the PCA. And then to be back with you again a week from today for the final and fourth episode, where we will talk all about the overtures that relate to the rules of discipline in the Book of Church Order. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Stories from the Presbyterian Pew is a resource of Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, a 501c3 nonprofit. We are 100% volunteer run and 100% donor supported. We want to keep this podcast ad-free, but in order to do that, we need the financial support of listeners like you. To make a one-time or recurring contribution, please visit presbyterianpew.org/donate. If you are interested in learning more about the governing document of the PCA, the Book of Church Order, please check out our free self-paced courses at presbyterianpew.org/courses. And if you have a question about PCA church government or something you have experienced in a PCA church, you can reach out through the form on our website at presbyterianpew.org/contact. Towards hope and healing, I'm Lynna Sutherland with Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew.